I didn't interrupt her when she said it. I didn't even look up right away. The HOA president was standing at the end of the folding table in the community hall, her voice echoing just a little too loudly off the cinder block walls as she explained that my new rental terms were illegal, predatory, and would be reversed immediately. She used words like unethical and abusive, as if she were delivering a prepared statement. I let her finish. Then I reached into my folder and placed a single yellow document on the table, sliding it toward the center so everyone could see the raised seal. It was the original ground lease, dated decades before the HOA existed, along with the recorded assignment that transferred it to me when my father died. I didn't say anything at first. I just waited. The room changed in a way that's hard to describe unless you've been in it. That moment when people realize they've been yelling at the wrong person, on the wrong ground, with no leverage left. Their attorney leaned forward, adjusted his glasses, and went quiet. That was when I knew the argument about rent was already over. Before all of that, my life on the land had been slow, deliberate, and honestly pretty humble. I didn't grow up wealthy, and I didn't inherit money the way people imagine when they hear numbers like 1,300 acres. What I inherited was responsibility. My family had owned the land for generations, long before anyone thought of carving it into neat lots with matching mailboxes and decorative streetlights. It was mostly pasture, scrub, and low-rolling hills, with an old farmhouse that leaned slightly to the west and a barn that needed more repairs every year. I moved back after my divorce, not because I had grand plans, but because I needed somewhere quiet to rebuild my life without being watched. My days were predictable in a way. That felt comforting. I fixed fences, cleared brush, drank coffee on the porch, and tried not to think too hard about how things had gone wrong before. I wasn't trying to control anything. I just wanted space to breathe. The HOA subdivision sat right in the middle of it all, like a carefully arranged island of sameness dropped onto land that had never asked for it. My father had leased that portion decades earlier, long before HOAs were what they are now, when a developer convinced him that a long-term ground lease would provide steady income without selling the land outright. At the time, it probably felt smart. The lease allowed homes to be built, roads to be paved, and an association to manage common areas, all while the land itself remained ours. By the time I inherited everything, the lease had been renewed twice, passed through multiple boards, and largely forgotten by the people living there. To them, the land was just the neighborhood. To me, it was still the ground my grandfather had worked with his hands. For years, there was no conflict at all. I barely interacted with the HOA beyond receiving the annual ground rent payment, which was modest but consistent. I waved at residents when I drove through to check fences or access another part of the property. I didn't attend meetings. I didn't make demands. I honestly think most of them forgot the land was leased at all. They paid their HOA dues, mowed their lawns, and assumed permanence. I didn't correct that assumption because I had no reason to. The lease still had years left on it, and I had no interest in changing anything. Stability was good for everyone. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter, printed on glossy letterhead and slipped into my mailbox as if it were doing me a favor. It informed me that the HOA board had voted to reassess legacy lease arrangements and intended to renegotiate the ground lease terms to better reflect current market realities. The language was polite but presumptive, written as though I were a contractor whose agreement was up for renewal, not the landowner. They suggested a meeting to discuss adjustments, including restrictions on my access to certain easements and limitations on future land use. I remember reading it twice and feeling more confused than offended. The lease wasn't up. It wasn't even close. There was nothing to renegotiate. I responded the way I always had, calmly and in writing. I cited the lease clause by clause, explained that the terms were fixed until expiration, and made it clear that I had no intention of altering access or usage beyond what was already agreed. I assumed that would be the end of it. Instead, I got silence. Weeks passed. Then the next letter came, this one less friendly, informing me that the HOA believed my interpretation was outdated and that they were consulting legal counsel. They began restricting my access to a service road that crossed the subdivision, claiming it was a private community amenity. I had driven that road my entire life. Suddenly, there were signs. That was when the tone shifted. Not to anger exactly, but to something colder and more focused. I requested a meeting. They scheduled it and then canceled the day before, citing board availability. Fines began appearing on paper addressed to me for things like unauthorized vehicle access and disruption of community enjoyment. None of it made sense, and all of it was unenforceable, but the message was clear. They were trying to establish control by paper cuts, hoping I'd back down or make a mistake. I stopped responding emotionally and started reading. I pulled the original lease from the county archives, not just my copy, but the recorded version with amendments and renewals. I read every page slowly, making notes in the margins. I researched state property law, ground lease precedents, and cases involving HOAs that sat on leased land. I learned how rare this situation actually was, and how often associations forgot, or chose to ignore, the fact that they didn't own the ground beneath them. I documented every sign they installed, every letter they sent, every instance of blocked access. At night, I spread papers across my kitchen table and worked until my eyes hurt. It wasn't panic. It was preparation. Neighbors began acting differently once the HOA escalated. People I'd waved to for years suddenly looked away. I heard rumors that the board was telling residents I planned to take their homes or shut down the community. None of it was true, but fear spreads faster than facts in places like that. My partner worried about what this would cost us emotionally and financially. I told her the truth. I wasn't looking for a fight, but I wasn't going to give up land my family had held on to just because someone decided to test me. The real turning point came when the HOA's attorney sent a formal demand letter asserting that the ground lease was unconscionable and would be challenged in court unless I agreed to restructure it on their terms. They proposed freezing rent at its current rate indefinitely while imposing new restrictions on my use of the surrounding acreage. It was bold in a way that bordered on delusional. They were threatening to sue me to force me to accept less control over my own land. That was when I stopped assuming incompetence and started recognizing entitlement. I hired my own attorney, not to negotiate, but to confirm what I already knew. He reviewed the documents, nodded slowly, and said something that stuck with me. He told me they'd been acting as if the land were theirs for so long that they'd forgotten how thin their position really was. He also pointed out something I hadn't considered yet. The lease included a rent adjustment clause tied to market valuations, one that had never been exercised. The language was clear. If either party requested a reassessment, it had to be done by independent appraisers, and the new rate would apply immediately. They'd opened that door themselves. I requested the reassessment. The appraisals took months. Independent firms evaluated the land as it existed now, not decades ago, factoring in development, location, and current market conditions. When the numbers came back, even I was surprised. The original rent, set when the area was rural and undeveloped, was laughably low by modern standards. The new figure was more than triple what they'd been paying. Perfectly legal, perfectly supported. I notified the HOA in writing, attaching the appraisals and the lease clause they'd apparently forgotten. I gave them 30 days' notice, exactly as required. That was the meeting we ended up in, the one where the president yelled and the attorney went pale. They argued hardship, community impact, unfairness. I listened, nodded once or twice, and reminded them that this reassessment was triggered by their own request to renegotiate. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was enforcing a contract. When they threatened litigation, my attorney slid his card across the table and suggested they reconsider. The room emptied quickly after that. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. The HOA scrambled. Dues went up. Board members resigned. Residents demanded explanations. Some were angry at me, others at the board. A few reached out privately to apologize for believing the rumors. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The land was still there, solid and unchanged, and so was my claim to it. Over time, the tone shifted again. People waved when they saw me. The signs blocking my access came down. The service road opened. The HOA paid the new rent. On time. Every time. Because they had no choice. Life returned to something like normal, but with a clarity that hadn't been there before. Everyone understood where the lines were now. I still wake up early. I still drink my coffee on the porch. The land hasn't changed, but my relationship to it has, sharpened by conflict and reaffirmed by law. Sometimes I think about how easily I could have avoided all of this by giving in, by agreeing to something reasonable, just to keep the peace. That's what they were counting on. But peace built on someone else's surrender isn't really peace at all. Now, when I drive through the subdivision, it's quiet. The houses are the same. The lawns are trimmed. The HOA still exists, but it's smaller somehow, less certain of itself. They know what's under their feet now, and so do I.